Welcome to this webinar on manufacturing in China for China. This is a really exciting trend that we're seeing taking place at the moment. And it is opening up opportunities for the many companies who have been long manufacturing in China and have now found an opportunity to sell to a client in China. And this trend and this opportunity really reflects the exciting and phenomenal story, which is the rise of China. I just want to spend a couple of minutes putting this webinar into a bit of context. So China's growth was on the back of manufacturing and an export-led economy. You can see this bear out in some statistics. In 1990, only around 3% of the world's goods were manufactured in China. Now it's around 80%. And what's important to emphasize is that China still is, in many ways, the country to go to get things made. You'll hear some talk about manufacturing being offshored to more cheaper, low-skilled countries elsewhere in Asia. But China's strength in manufacturing still lies in its great clusters, and the clusters around that enable certain products and categories to really shine through in certain areas in China. So you can see 80% of the world's air conditioners, 70% of the mobile phones, 60% of shoes are all manufactured in China, and they're likely to be manufactured and made in very similar regions. In some cases, whole towns are just focused on one commodity, one product category. So China still is a great place to manufacture goods. What has changed significantly in those couple of decades that we're talking about the rise of China, 2 or 3 decades, in fact, is the rise of China as a place for companies to go and sell their products. China's now, in my opinion, the most exciting consumer market in the world. The rise of the urban middle class is one of the phenomena of our time, and these statistics, often quoted from McKinsey, clearly demonstrates that from 2000, the urban middle class as a percentage of urban population will grow from 2 or 3% to 2020, which is just a few years away now, to 3/4 of that population. They're all mostly internet users. They're all growing in their consumption, their private consumption ability, to the point where in a decade or so's time, they'll have an average purchasing power equal to that of the USA. And so while China's still a strong manufacturing and export economy, it's now becoming an incredibly strong consumer-led economy. And so for many foreign brands from the UK, or Europe, or the States, or other Western economies, this presents an excellent opportunity, and presents an opportunity to take advantage of supply chains in China to actually fulfill sales within China. And just to emphasize how much this has changed, when LNP started about 10 years ago, at one point about 100%, pretty much 100% of our business was around sourcing, is around manufacturing in China. Now it's almost completely reversed, to the point where over 90% of our business is helping companies sell to China. So that just reflects that transition, that change the economy's gone through. So if you were a company sourcing in China, it was quite straightforward. It still is quite straightforward. You enter into an international purchase contract with a supplier out in China. You make payments, and then those manufacturers, usually OEM manufacturers, will then export to your export markets around the world. Very simple model, and importantly, a model whereby you don't need an actual entity in China to fulfill such orders. Important considerations around quality control around finding a trusted and reputable supplier, but you do not need an entity to make that happen unless you're manufacturing under your own facility. But if you were suddenly faced with the challenge of looking to sell to China, that's when the challenges start to emerge. And you can see, if you were working with a manufacturer in China, but without an entity in China, having to fulfill sales in China presents many challenges. And just like some of these companies that we've seen face this challenge, so from a major manufacturer of gym equipment from Europe, who have been manufacturing in China for about 2 decades, now we're faced with the challenge of having, a good challenge of having a deal with one of the leading distributors in this industry out in China, but with the only option presented to them to fulfill direct from their factory in China. Obviously not ideal, and we'll go into some of those considerations shortly. Or a major manufacturer of fruit farming equipment had a deal along with a global client who landed a client in China, and they needed to fulfill those deals, but again, all of the parts and the assembly has always been done in China. So without an entity there, how do they get the product from supplier to customer? Or many fashion brands we've seen in this situation. It's not surprising that the majority of fashion brands have their manufacturing base in China, but now many high-end, so-called kind of moderate or high-end luxury fashion brands now have a huge market in China itself. So how do they get around that challenge? Especially in the case, it's quite common for a clothing brand to have a dozen factories that they're working with. But if you've just got one client, how do you consolidate all of that and fulfill the deal within China? So you need a solution. You need a solution that overcomes some of these specific challenges laid out in these questions. So obviously, you can't let your supplier develop a direct relationship with your customer for concerns of control and quality and supply chain. You need to consider when you need to export and then re-import as one solution to overcoming that issue of control of your supply chain between your supplier and customer. When do you need to have a subsidiary in China to be able to fulfill such deals? And like many companies, your manufacturer might be in an export processing zone in China. And if that's the case, what are the further considerations you need to take into account in order to fulfill sales? So we'll go through some of these and go through some of your main options if you're in this situation. And so if you're in this situation, it's likely that you're faced with one of these requests. So your customer out in China may ask for a local VAT invoice, for example, in Chinese called a fapiao. And we explored the elements of a fapiao in a previous webinar on getting paid in China. You might need to provide local contracts for a local customer and therefore need to operate the deal locally. You may want to look to maximize tax efficiency through minimizing the import duties in that case of round tripping. So in all of these circumstances, you'll need a solution in place. And so we'll run very quickly through option number 1, if not just to rule it out, to be honest, because having a direct relationship between your supplier and your customer is not a good idea for very obvious reasons. However, it is a solution that your supplier in China, when you raise this issue with them, will offer up as as an option. They have an interest to do so, and we've come across many clients whereby their supplier is offering this solution to them. But you're going to lose control over almost every element of your supply chain in China, indeed your brand in China, handing over quality control, handing over information about the margins. You're effectively giving up on the brand in China. So unless it's your own production facility, if you're working with a outsourced supplier, OEM manufacturers, this is clearly not an option you want to pursue. So an alternative to this, which gives you back control of your supply chain, is to essentially round trip the goods. So export them out of China as you would normally when you're using a supplier for global orders, and then re-import back into the country. However, you will need either for your distributor to have an import license, or your customer in China to have an import license to enable you to do this, or an entity in place to act as an importer of record when the goods are coming back in. Even if you have such a structure in place, still with this option, you're essentially duplicating duties. So you're going to be paying export duties when the goods leave the country, and then also import duties when they come back in. And on top of that, you've got to consider the cost of shipping. So even if they're just going to somewhere like Hong Kong or Singapore, a relatively close port to China, you still have to take into consideration the transportation costs and long lead times for your customer, which may not be acceptable. Many customers in China these days expect short lead times because that's what they know they can get from your competition. So round tripping, not ideal, does get around the issue of control, lack of control over your supply chain, which option number one presents, but still there are these wider considerations that doesn't make it very efficient in terms of tax or cost. So option number three, and really our recommended option, is to have some kind of entity in China to act as the middleman, if you like, within this deal, within this kind of operating structure. So very simply, and sorry to put a flowchart in a webinar, but I couldn't resist, is to have the entity receive funds from your Chinese customer, issue them with their VAT invoice, their fapiao in Chinese, use those funds to cover the costs of manufacturing in China, whether it's one supplier or multiple suppliers, and then either keep retained profit within China, or you can repatriate some of that back to your overseas entity. And the beauty of this kind of model is that not only does it give you control over your supply chain, it's also incredibly efficient from a tax perspective. You don't have to take into consideration the repatriation of all your funds. You're basically covering, you're using the funds that you're receiving as revenue to cover your costs, and you're going to simply pay VAT on the difference between the cost and the sales price. And it keeps it very clean as well. Again, we covered repatriation of profits in a previous webinar that you can check out on our website. But for this model, you don't have to take into consideration repatriation of funds because all the funds are staying within China. You have a couple of options for using an entity. First is to set up your own wholly foreign owned enterprise, known as a WFOE, which gives you complete ownership over an entity in China, which is particularly important for companies, perhaps if they have investment backing. However, it's lengthy setup time, shorter than it used to be, but still you're looking at a setup time of around a few months. Obviously higher upfront investment and cost to set up an entity in China. And there's the consideration of potentially winding it down if your deals don't work out. So if you know that deals may be in the pipeline for 6 to 12 months down the line, then this might be an option for you, or if ownership is particularly important for you. Or if you've got a deal potentially lined up in a couple of weeks, this is difficult as you just simply can't get a WFI set up in that amount of time. It's not like setting up a company in the UK, US, or many Western markets. So the second option is to use an agent. So you would contract with an agent to act as your agent to facilitate this deal. They would be the one purchasing from the supplier. They would be the one facilitating the sale to your customer. Shorter setup time, so if you are in that situation of having a high degree of urgency, this is a good solution. You do need to consider the balance of control, which this kind of structure does give you, against ownership, which this structure doesn't give you. And you need to make sure that that agent has a strong presence on the ground, because whichever option that you choose, it's important that you establish very strong local account management to deal with both the client and your supplier in China. Unlike just dealing with a supplier who's managing your export orders, or just a customer which you're selling to from overseas in China, it's difficult to do both, we found, from overseas. Whether it be an outsourced agent, whether it be in-house staff, to have an account management team on the ground respond in real time in their own language, with local knowledge of operations in China, with both your supplier and customer, is key. We've seen deals fall through lack of local account management in China, because there are a few considerations which we'll go through now, which make this model still tricky even with an entity in China, and therefore making the need for local account managers very high. So firstly, pricing. We've seen with pricing, companies cause unnecessary challenges for themselves through quoting too early before they have a structure in place. So remember, with a make and sell model like this, you'll need to take into consideration domestic Chinese VAT, potentially even import VAT if you're dealing with an export processing zone. And therefore, the cost of your sale increases. So get all of that right first time. Don't quote and then figure out what the solution is. We've seen companies come to us and have quoted prices to their client without taking into consideration things like taxes, things like duties, and therefore they take a hit on their margins. The flow of payments, and understanding the flow of payments and how they should be structured, is really important as well. So firstly, you'll need to make sure that the payment terms that you have with your customers in China mirror basically those that you'll have with your supplier. So if it's 100% upfront, make sure you've got that in place with your supplier as well. If it's 50 upfront, 50 on delivery, then again, don't put yourself in a situation whereby you don't have enough money coming in from clients to cover the cost of your supplier, and therefore you can't actually release the goods and fulfill the deal. Also, with regards to tax and issuing VAT invoices, these are the FAPIAOs. You've got a picture of one on this slide. It's important to get the timing of this right. So because VAT is declared on a monthly basis and the tax office have a live track record of the VAT invoices that have been issued, you'll need to get the VAT invoice in from your supplier, ideally within the same month that you issue one to your customer, so you can offset that VAT and you don't put yourself in a position where you have a particular high tax bill that month, especially, or that quarter when it comes to corporation tax as well. And make sure all of this is documented well in contracts. We emphasize this again and again in all of our webinars and all of our content that we put out. to educate companies about doing business in China. Get the pricing terms laid out clearly, get it in a dual language contract, and just don't leave yourself exposed where you're in the position of either not having any goods or not having your money. And just very quickly, a note about export processing zones, because we do come across this quite frequently. An export processing zone is basically a category of a free trade zone, but for the sole purpose of assembly and manufacturing for export. And importantly, they're subject to restrictions with regards to the manufacturing of goods for sale within China. So although these zones are in mainland China, for the purpose of fulfilling sales, they're actually not, if that makes sense. And you'll need an importer of record, basically in the same way as you would for importing goods from other countries if your manufacturer is in one of these zones. And this is an example of one which is in Shandong, where one of our clients dealt with a manufacturer in this zone and therefore needed an importer of record in place. But importantly, again, they needed an entity to act as that importer of record because they didn't want to reveal the margins direct to their customer, who could have acted as an importer of record as well. So to wrap up, 5 quick tips for success if you're in the situation of manufacturing in China and looking to sell in China. Set up a structure to have that middle entity between the supplier and customer. That is the optimal structure to have. Make sure you uncover all the costs of domestic sale before quoting. Coordinate those timings of payments and the timings of the VAT invoices as well, and document it in all contracts. Establish whether your manufacturer is in an export processing zone, because it might not be immediately apparent that they are. It won't necessarily say specifically on their address. And finally, have strong local account managers to maintain those relationships between the client and suppliers in China. So that wraps up the webinar. As Dave said, these are the 20-minute snapshots of different subjects. LNP are here to help. Many Western companies, when selling to China, find great opportunities, but often get stuck. They struggle with fulfillment of projects, operational rollout, as rules and business practice in China are really, really quite different. So we resolve these issues by providing full back office operational services, allowing clients to reach multi-million-dollar turnover within months. And we've done this with many well-known brands, many small and medium-sized companies over the years. And we have offices in Beijing, Shanghai, and here in the UK to